All right, so thank you again for joining us with another talk story. And here I have a friend. And would you please introduce yourself for us?
Yep. My name is Robert Fisher. I'm researcher at the United States Geological Survey, and my office is here in California in San Diego. I'm a research supervisory research biologist, and I have a kind of a team that works for me. I've got my PhD 25 plus years ago, and part of my research for my PhD was in the Pacific, understanding the role of humans in moving species around the Pacific. And I was focused on, at that point, on geckos. And so I've been working in the Pacific region on a variety of lizards and other species for going on 3 decades now. And a lot of that work centers around Fiji, but Solomon's, Vanuatu, elsewhere around the Pacific. And happy to be here with Patrick and to be able to have a conversation. I'm sitting here in my house because we're still COVID shut down. So this is my home office. I've got that picture from John Richmond there from Guadalcanal. That's pseudocyanura he gave me for my 50th birthday. And then there's a mask I got from Vanuatu back in '88, I think, when I was in Vanuatu back then. So
nice. Yeah, thanks, Rob, for spending this time with us. And we've done a couple of work on Guadalcanal during the 2015 Guadalcanal survey. Well, since you mentioned Guadalcanal, let's start at Guadalcanal, because straight after the Guadalcanal surveys, and today we're going to talk about the trade in wildlife. Straight after the Guadalcanal surveys, I remember, if I'm correct, you mentioning that there was a shipment of vertebrates, not sure which species, from the Solomons to the US. And that was my first initiation into the pet trade, because I've been always a field biologist working on the field part of surveys. And then the pet trade came up when you mentioned this. Now, the nature of the pet trade, it's a very clandestine operation. The illegal pet trade and even the things that are going out with government approval. And our understanding of the pet trade is very patchy. We once it leaves our shores, we have no idea what happens or where they go. So my first question is, how big is the pet trade?
yeah, no, it's big. It's billions of dollars a year, I think. I mean, it's a big deal. And the thing is that, to me, it was surprising to come off of being in remote Guadalcanal doing the field work, and then getting here and going to the pet store and just seeing all these lizards and frogs from Guadalcanal in for sale there, and then seeing the part that was really surprising was, like you said, it was very open. Like the guys who were shipping them out, they were posting on Facebook about their trip around Guadalcanal, and here's the guys they were collecting the animals with, and then they were very open about the work, and that's because what they were doing was, parts of it were legal by the Solomon regulatory authorities. It was parts that weren't. The reason I found out about it was that they had maybe an export permit for 20 monitor lizards, but then there was 40 in the box. And so they got in trouble for shipping things in that were over their limits. And some of those got confiscated. But it was kind of surprising to see that Solomon's has a legal export trade, commercial export trade, whereas no other country in the region does have that. PNG doesn't have that. Fiji's never had that. Samoa's never had that. Vanuatu's not had that. And so it's always only been the Solomons And as long as I can remember back, before I was even involved, but I know people that in the 70s, they were involved in the pet trade from the Solomons. It's been the only, country that's kind of permitted that in the region. Indonesia does and has something, but never these other countries, not PNG, not Fiji in particular. So it was, but I thought it had closed down, and then in 2015, seeing the diversity of species was kind of shocking, and it just continues to today, and that's where, like you said, like we don't think about it because we're not seeing people catching the animals when we're out there in the bush, but it's they're harvesting constantly to feed this market that's quite large.
It's very interesting that PNG, which is the most diverse country in the region, not exporting wildlife. What Papua New Guinea does export in terms of wildlife is their largest export are crocodile skins. And those are reptiles that are farmed in proper farms, and they're harvested from managed populations of the saltwater crocodile and the New Guinea freshwater crocodile. So those are managed farms that are harvesting their own wildlife stocks and exporting them. And interestingly, most end up in France and in Japan. And so, and also in Australia. Australia, I think, is for the meat. In France, and Japan, my guess is that it's there for the fashion, the trade that is exported there. Wow. So, so it's just the Solomons that's sending out all this diversity. Now, a lot of wildlife that I've seen on the CITES database that come out from the Solomons are parrots. And that is probably because Solomons does have a very high percentage of endemic birds. And the quantities are enormous, up to numbers like 65,000 individuals. Now, can you, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so the parrot thing is a different issue. So there's this group called Traffic has done some reports on the Solomon parrot trade, and what they showed was that the ships coming from Indonesia and from that are coming to take logs are bringing birds that are harvested in other countries. They're bringing them to the Solomons, and then they're permitting them in the Solomons and then shipping them out. So they're illegally smuggling them into the Solomons, saying they're being farmed, and then shipping them out of the Solomons. So some of those numbers are not birds from the Solomons. They're birds from elsewhere that are being laundered through the Solomons. And so it's very different in that, and they were bringing up, what I understand is they're bringing them in on the empty logging ships that are coming to get logs from the Solomons. So they're bringing in birds and taking away logs. And there's a couple of, we can maybe post some websites. I'll give you a website for the traffic report where they talk about that. And I was unaware of that. That's where those numbers are coming from. I understand they're not, it's different than the reptile trade where they're reptiles that are from the Solomons being exported. They're animals being laundered through the Solomons. Right. They're legally brought into the Solomons, then legally shipped out of the Solomons. Isn't that weird?
That is interesting. I've never heard that before. All along, I thought those were numbers from Solomons, and it kind of it confused me because they're huge numbers. And populations on islands are very small, as you know. And so even in conducting field surveys, the intensity of nets going up in the field to quantify some of those numbers has to be huge. So those records on the CITES database were, they're quite alarming. But now that you explain it, makes sense. Let's talk about reptiles. So what are the reptiles going off overseas from Solomon's?
So referring to CITES just for another moment, their CITES is an interesting, it's supposed to protect the international trade, and countries are members of CITES, and then they get a certain allocation. Like they say, we want this many, we're going to export this many of this thing as part of it. And from the Solomons, the reptiles, besides the crocodiles and sea turtles that are like CITES Appendix 1, the other things that are would be the monitors and the boas, and those are CITES Appendix 2. And so that those do have to abide by CITES permit regulations. But CITES Appendix 2 is an easier export quota system than Appendix 1. And in the US and elsewhere in the trade, some of the things that people really want are these unique monitor lizards. And so the things that jump out are, there's two endemic monitor lizards in the Solomons. And so those are really like highlighted. They're things people want. And the numbers of the monitors coming off of, I guess, Choiseul and such is really high. Like it's hard to believe that they're collecting that many. I think it's, of the roughneck monitors, or I forget what the common name is. And luckily they're not collecting the ones on Renel yet, but I know that one is going to be, if people were able to get those, they could export them through that CITES Appendix 2 clause, and they would have a high value, that Just Indicus, the one that's on Renel. The boas are also CITES, and they have some value, but less value because they're not spectacular or endemic the way the monitors are. The one that is really the thing that everybody wants is the Corucia, right? The Solomon Islands skink, and that one is not listed as CITES, and there's been pressure by, I think, other countries to try to get it CITES listed, but it's never been CITES listed. And so, but what the United States has done is they've instituted a ban on importing wild Corucia, and they've had this ban for, I'm not sure how long, maybe a decade or more. So the Solomons is not allowed, like if somebody gets an export permit from the Solomons for Corucia, they have to say that they're farm raised. And if they don't say that, if they says that they're wild, then they automatically rejected by the US and they can't bring them in. Other countries don't have that ban that have. So what you see is then the export permits from the Solomons actually say the Corucia are ranched or farm raised. and I don't know where those farms are in the Solomons. I've never seen them. And you see these animals that look like they're 10, 15 years old, scarred up, and they're the ones that are farm raised. And so that's a weird regulatory gap. And as you and I were talking about recently, there was a big confiscation of animals into the U.S. of Corucia. Again, I think there was 34 or so. It was some big number, and multiple zoos had to take them from the Fish and Wildlife Service, who had them in small aquariums, when they confiscated them. And you could see them on people's websites in the US for $1,000 a piece, the Corucia being advertised. And when I was talking with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I brought up, your concerns about can we ship them back to the Solomons, and they have said there's no capacity to do that. And who would they ship them to? Who would receive them in the Solomons, and how would they go somewhere? Like there's no arrangement to do that. And what they told me was that I would be shocked to see the numbers that have come into the US in the last 2-3 years. of Corucia that made it through the U.S. system, and I haven't yet been able to get that data, but it sounds like it's many hundreds, if not thousands of them that have been brought in just recently. And I do know that I have seen before COVID, they have these reptile shows where people have all the animals trying to sell. And I noticed one of them in 2018 or so, 2019, where they had island specific Corucia that they were selling for money. They were saying this one is from Malaita or this one is from here, and they're trying to have these site specific ones, and so then that is going to drive the trade from being just Corucia to now everybody wants one from Gizo or the one from Colombamara or whatever because they look a little different, and that was surprising to me. I had never seen that, and that means an elevated level of sophistication in Solomons and working with local villages in those islands to collect those, then transport them to Guadalcanal, manage them as unique islands, and then ship them out as those unique island names. So I don't know if any of that's, I mean, I saw that they were labeled that way. I don't know that, that's true that they're from those individual islands, but they were highlighting them and then getting more money for them because they could say it was from the specific place.
Wow, that's really next level.
Yeah.
There's that kind of just brings up a study that was done by Julie Hagen about lot of quite a while back, about 10 years ago now, maybe longer than that. That I think she did some genetics study on to see if there was some differentiation between the Corucias between those islands. Morphologically, there may be a slight difference, but I don't really remember the results from the genetic study. But yeah, well, this kind of highlights also the level of value that's placed on island endemic species. Anything from islands are highly valued because of the rarity that comes with the individual species. Now, when the Corucia is exported to the US, where do they normally end up?
Most of them in the garbage because they end up dying, and that's the sad part of the story, right? So that they're not, like, as they're a species that lives in these family communities in a tree, and now they're taking all of the different individuals from that tree and shipping them, and some will die during transport, and then when they arrive here, somebody might buy one or two of them if they even survive to get to market, let's say. And then so now you've broken up that community, the family unit that was living in the tree together. And I honestly think that most of them just die and end up in the garbage. And I know that from that set in 2015 because some of the guys that received them at the pet stores, they died right away, and they froze them for me. And I have some downstairs in my freezer still, from 2015 from the pet stores. And I think that because they have a low turnover, like they're producing 1 to 2, they have very low reproductive output, and they live for a long time. That we don't see like the farming like you saw for the crocodiles. You don't see that response where there's a population in the US that is supporting the market in the US. It's not. It's a harvest-based system where we have to continue to harvest new animals to sell them because there's no sustainability in the US because people aren't breeding them, people aren't maintaining them in the social systems that they need to be. I think there are people here that are successful with them, but success might mean they're producing a couple of Corucia a year or a couple of years. But that's not producing the hundreds that there's a market for, or thousands, or whatever there's a market. And this is just the US. Europe has their own market for them, and they don't have the restriction that the US has on having to be farm raised, which isn't really a restriction. It's just a change on the, it's a permit designation when they fill out the permits. And so to me, I think the awareness, I mean, it's a Solomon Island issue. Like, they have to decide, do we want to be, harvest our natural resources that might not be sustainable, like Corucia, like trees, like other things, or do we want to do things in a sustainable way, or not have a market in that at all, because it really might not be supporting the local communities the way other, like ecotourism or other things, might be supporting the local communities. And so that to me is a local, societal value that I think the Solomon is in a different place on than PNG or Fiji or some others, where they've made the decision not to harvest some of those natural resources in a non-sustainable way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, just going back to the point that you raised about the social requirements of the Corucia. Once again, Julie Hagen did a study on the radio tracking the Corucia. And yes, they're only found in one tree, really. And they're mostly associated with the strangler figs, the big figs. And they hardly go anywhere. They're only found in families on that one tree. That also is kind of an advantage for the species in the wild, because, as you know, Solomons has a big issue with unsustainable logging. And normally when the forest is cleared and the trees are harvested, the strangler figs tend to remain. They're not valued. And so the habitat for that species is still there. But so I think the main concern is the actual trade, is the human harvesting for sale. And so that kind of, we should, deforestation, I should say, is a problem, because it's unsustainable. So Corucia ends up in the US, and the survival rates are very low. We've just submitted a paper, as you know, to a journal with the recommendation to cease all trade in the wild harvesting of Corucia. And that, that's just a recommendation, but like you said, it's a Solomon Island government decision, and we can only make the scientific and the social recommendation to cease that trade. If it was properly managed, perhaps there would be a trade there for locals, but at the moment, everything is just harvested in the wild. Now, that's just one skink, that one monkey-tailed skink. There are also frogs that are going out, which was very interesting. Now, how I did not know about frogs being exported until we had to go to court in 2010 and represent a company, a forestry FSC at the time, FSC certified company that had a logging company encroach into its fixed term estate. And the FSC, the timber company, had won a court case and was looking at a financial settlement. And so there was a log assessment, and there was also a wildlife assessment to see how much was lost. So that got us looking at the value of wildlife. And I didn't realize that species such as the Solomon eyelash frog, It used to be Ceratobatrachus guentheri. I think now it's Cornifer
Yeah.
guentheri. I didn't realize that that species amongst the all of the Solomys and the Weberi were exported as well to the US. Can you shed some light on the trade in frogs?
Yeah. Yeah, it's big. I was at a aquarium just 2 weeks ago, a week ago, in Long Beach, and they had a small frog set up, and they had a Guentheri in there, and my understanding is there's a high mortality rate in that frog, and it's difficult because they're bringing them from the forest where it's collecting them at night, it's wet, it's cold, down to Guadalcanal, and it's hot and dry, or it's just, and there's a high mortality in transporting them, even to get them to a place where you can ship them overseas. And so the numbers that show up here are still shocking numbers of Ceratobatrachus or Guentheri, but that's a small portion of the total numbers that are being harvested because of the high mortality rate within the Solomons, transporting them from the forest to ultimately to being shipped in an airplane. And this guy that was bringing them out in 2015, he was posting about that how they were trying to solve the problem and how they were able to get these healthy ones exported, and so they do have a high value. That's, as from my perspective, what I've seen, that's the number one frog that people want from the Solomons, is that frog, and that's the one that I'm most familiar with seeing in the trade. But it might be that it's just harvested at the largest numbers, and that Weberi and the other ones are being exported as well, but they're just they have less value, maybe, I'm not sure. But no, definitely that, from the amphibian perspective, I think that there's a big trade in that. I do think that that probably could become sustainable if you managed it well, because the numbers of frogs produced is much greater than the numbers of Corucia, and you could probably have some sustained harvest, that would be, and especially if you went to places pre-logging and harvested from places that were going to be turned into plantation or become non-suitable habitat, you could maybe have some resource utilization from places that are going to be taken, but not the, like, I can't speak to the exact numbers, but it just seems like it's an awful lot of frogs that are being exported to have some that they can actually sell here on this side. Back on Corucia for a minute. So the reason I heard about the Corucia that were just taken at Los Angeles airport recently was because my brother, he's a director of a zoo in Orange County, not far from Los Angeles, and he was contacted by the Fish and Wildlife Service about whether he wanted any Corucia because they had to get rid of them. And so he ended up taking 8 of them. And so all of those 34 or whatever survive are at different zoos scattered around. And they're not, they'll live for some amount of time, and his got a vet checkups like that, but they're not they're not part of the natural population anymore, and we don't know even where they were taken from. And like you said, like, these figs are left, and once you harvest from a fig in an area that's been deforested otherwise, they're not going to get back to those trees. They're going to be lost from that landscape. And so it's really I think it needs, your paper is a good first step, but it really needs a lot of discussion around the value of that species to the country.